You're listening to A Slice of Therapy with me, Alun Parry. So in yesterday's podcast was my first interview on this show, and it was with John Lamerton, who is a business author and business coach, as well as a successful business person as well. And of the many ideas that he raised was something called marginal gains theory. And it really caught my attention, and I can say it's caught your attention as well, because a lot of you have been contacting me to say, this sounds fascinating, do you have any ideas to how this can be applied? So what I thought I would do is put together a roadmap for how you would actually do marginal gains theory. So in this episode, I'm going to cover three things. First of all, I'm going to just give you a quick refresher on what marginal gains theory is. Although, of course, if you want to hear more in more detail, then please do listen to the interview with John, because he goes into it in some detail. But the first thing I'll do is I'll remind you what marginal gains theory is. Secondly, we'll look at the importance of the rule of three. And thirdly, we'll look at tiny upgrades. So in terms of marginal gains theory, what is that? Well, it's the idea, as John laid out yesterday, that if you take anything and break it down to its constituent parts, you can actually improve each of those constituent parts just by a tiny amount. And then when you put the whole thing back together again, it'll be massively increased in terms of its performance. So John gave the analogy of you take a transistor radio, you take all the bits out, you improve them all, you put them back together, you've got a much better radio. And of course, this all started with British cycling, that Dave Brailsford became the performance director of British cycling, which hadn't won anything of significance in a century, and then suddenly came to dominate the sport. And the reason that it was able to dominate the sport was through this marginal gains theory that John spoke about, this process of actually breaking things into their constituent parts and just giving them a tiny upgrade. And then together, all of those changes, even though they were only small, have a massive effect because they're all compounded together. So now you know what marginal gains theory is, the idea of breaking things down into their parts and giving them a tiny upgrade, and then making sure that everything put back together then is greater than the sum of their parts. Let's move on to how we could actually do that. And the first thing I want to look at is rule of three. Now, the rule of three is something that's kind of embedded as almost like an organizing number in our mind. We seem to respond to things happening in pattern of threes. Even when I do a PowerPoint presentation, if I've got 3 bullet points on, it looks quite nice. If I put a fourth on, it looks cluttered. And so there's something about our minds that really like the rule of three. If you think back to nursery rhymes, for instance, or nursery songs, there's 3 blind mice, there's the 3 little pigs, and there's Goldilocks, and how many bears? And you hear as well in kind of speeches, so orators will often use the rule of three in order to make their point emphatic. So you'll hear politicians, and they'll say, not only will I do this, not only will I do that, but I'll do this as well, and everybody cheers. So there's something about that rule of three that's really helpful to us. And so what I'm going to propose then is, if you're looking at a way of actually breaking down the component parts of something, like how do you actually do it, you can take the tool of the rule of three in order to make it easy to break things down. So let me give an example. Let's say, for instance, that our objective wasn't to win a bicycle race, but our objective was something in life. And it might be something as simple as, I want to feel better. So if we take that and start breaking it down, rather than trying to do a big brainstorm of hundreds of things, which can feel overwhelming, we can instead just go with a rule of three. So I can say to myself, well, okay, if I want to feel better, what are the three kind of broad areas I might want to look at? And I don't know, I might come up with, well, the mind, the body, my environment. And, it doesn't matter which three you choose. Any three will do, just to start you on the road of this organising principle. So straight away, off the top of my head, I can come up with them. Well, if I want to feel better, I probably need to look at what's going on in my mind, what's going on in my body, and, what's going on around me in my environment. And I've got those three things written on a piece of paper. I can just use the rule of three again. I can say, okay, so what are the three things that I might actually come up with for my mind? What are the three broad areas there as well? Now, bear in mind, it's very loose. It's just top of the head stuff. So, when I did this exercise a moment ago, just before I started speaking here, literally a moment ago, I thought, well, the mind, maybe it's kind of meditation might be one. Another broad area might be kind of positivity. Another area might be appreciation. And again, it doesn't matter which three you choose. In fact, once you start working with these bundles of three, you'll start notice other things popping up that you could have put in that bundle of three and is still underneath that category. But once you start getting into this habit of just picking out a bundle of three things, you can revisit categories and come up with a fresh bundle of three. So under body, off the top of my head, I wrote down, well, what I eat, my exercise, and my sleep. That'd be three things probably that might be good categories, subcategories for the body. And under environment, I wrote where I live, where I go, and who I'm with. Now, already what I've come up with there from feeling better, I've got mind, body, and environment. I've got meditation. I've got positivity. I've got appreciation. I've got food, sleep, exercise. I've got where I live, where I go, who I'm with, all off the top of my head. And then, because I'm working in these bundles of three, if I just keep revisiting mind, body, and environment, then what happens then is I'll naturally come up with something else. I'll think, well, yeah, motivation maybe, sense of purpose, and, I don't know, comedy, laughing. Or I might think in terms of the body, well, what I see, what I hear, what I smell. Even in terms of like breaking it down for each of these subcategories, you can then investigate again if you want to. Another rule of three. So for instance, under body, I put food, sleep, and exercise. But I could break exercise down into a further rule of three, couldn't I? I could say, well, under exercise, I might organise that as stamina, strength, flexibility. And so very, very quickly, from just feeling better, by just coming up off the top of my head with no kind of, with no seriousness to it at all, with no real rigidity, just very easy energy, coming up with bundles of three, picking any category or subcategory that we've come up with at any moment and saying, well, what would be the rule of three for this thing? Where I live, for instance, might be, I don't know, the kind of home I have. Like, and by that I mean, is it a house or a flat? Or it might be, for instance, how tidy it is. It might be, for instance, where it's located. So all of these things you can break down into rules of three, and you don't have to go on forever, because already here in front of me, I've got about 18 to 20 things. And that's enough then to start the final part of this, which is to investigate where the tiny upgrades are. So far we've gone over what marginal gains theory is. We've gone through how you can use that packaging of the rule of three to break any topic down into three nice, quick, off the top of your head, back of the envelope kind of subcategories. And now the final step is to start investigating where the tiny upgrades might come in. And all you really need to do is to look at each label that you come up with and think, well, how could I tweak that? How could I give that a tiny upgrade? So, for example, I mentioned meditation before. At the moment, I'm not meditating. So what would happen if I meditated, say, an additional minute a day? I'll go from 0 minutes to 1 minute. Maybe that's something that would benefit me in some way. Maybe even 30 seconds would. Set the alarm on my phone and just sit there and meditate for 30 to 60 seconds. In terms of my food, is there any way in which I could, I don't know, have one less junk food snack? Even if it was one less a week, that's a tiny upgrade, isn't it? In terms of where I live, is there any way that I could, I don't know, make one small part of the house, maybe the part that I'm in most, a little bit tidier? And so you can go through this all the time, just asking the question, how could this just be a tiny little bit better? And as you start making things a tiny little bit better, then what you're actually doing for yourself is what Dave Brailsford did for British cycling. And you see the results, don't you? They made these tiny tweaks and they went from not winning anything of note for over a century to absolutely dominating the sport. So what would that be for you if you break down your component parts using the rule of 3 and just give it the tiniest of tweaks? Now, the 3 things we've covered in this is, first of all, we've gone over marginal gains theory, the idea that you can just break things down and simultaneously give things a 1% tweak upwards. Secondly, as a kind of roadmap of how to actually break things down, we've used that simple idea of the rule of 3 just to make it easier, the whole kind of Goldilocks and the 3 bears. And appropriately for Goldilocks, that number 3 just seems to be just right in terms of helping us break things down very quickly without any kind of tension or focus, just back of the envelope. And then once we've got those categories, we can just pick a few things out that seem to be most ripe for a tiny improvement. Is there something slightly better I could do with exercise? Is there something slightly healthier that I could switch my eating to? Is there a tiny improvement that I could do with my sleep, for instance? A squirt of lavender around the bed, for instance, or read a book instead of going on my phone. Once you've actually broken it down into the rule of 3, you're able then to start asking those questions about tiny upgrades. And what you see then is that there's a real infinity of possibility, of opportunity for life to get better. Now, the topic we started with here was feeling better. It needn't have been that topic. You could have started with some other goal. It might be like John, a business goal. It might be a relational goal. It could be absolutely anything, but whatever it is, using this rule of 3 to back of the envelope, break it down into its component parts, you'll very quickly have a nice list of things where you can think, how do I make this just a little better? And of course, you're not aiming for a radical improvement in each of the little things. The radical improvement comes from tiny gains, and those tiny gains together will do the legwork for you. If you found this episode useful, please do share it so other people can get the benefits as well. If you'd like to work with me directly, I'm Alun Parry, and you can find more about me at liverpoolpsychotherapy.co.uk. And of course, you don't have to be local to me because I work online, so you can be based absolutely anywhere. And of course, please subscribe to the podcast as well, because it's absolutely free and it means that you'll never miss an episode again. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you again on the next one.